Hi, I'm Dr. Philip McMillan. Thank you very much for joining me again as I continue to share with you some of the science around the COVID 19 pandemic. For those who don't know me, I've been researching COVID 19 since early 2020. Came up with an original idea about autoimmunity and that being the primary mechanism of severe disease. That thought hasn't changed. I've been working with researchers across the world looking at this and trying to predict what it means in the context of the pandemic. So, today I'm going to talk to you about the fact that, believe it or not, you are part of a COVID 19 challenge study. This is whether or not you want to accept it, it's just the reality. In this presentation, I'm going to be sharing a few ideas about one, what is a challenge study? And I'll go through that. Healthy volunteers exposed intentionally to a pathogen. And I'll be going through which groups you may be in and what kinds of outcomes we'd be interested in finding out. And that's the essence of what I'll be focused on today. And so, before I start that, for those people who are interested and who had recently missed the webinar on how to prepare for the next wave of the COVID 19 pandemic, please click on the link below. It's now in the format of a course, and I would be very happy for your support by going through it and giving suggestions if there are any things that we have missed. If you are interested in other bits of information, you can go to the MR Education website, and it's right here. And it had lots of free courses and other courses that have been building out over a period of time. Please, if you're interested, again, click on the links below. So let's get back to the point. COVID 19 challenge study. Well, really, what is this about and how is it relevant? Well, as I said before, you're all, not you, we are all in about three specific groups. And you have to remember that when we look at the pandemic, the main aim was to stop the pandemic. Because in theory, whatever intervention we used early on, the hope was that it would produce adequate amounts of immunity. There wouldn't be able to be transmission of the virus, so you'd have herd immunity at population level, and the pandemic is over. Sadly, that's not the case. Some may argue it's because of variants. Others may argue it may be because our intervention was not effective enough. Whatever it is, we are now into a phase of the pandemic that nobody properly predicted. And in this phase, we are all in a few different groups. But before we go into the groups, let's just cover what I mean by a challenge study. So, this is what a challenge study is. So it's a research study, and this is real, a type of scientific research study in which healthy volunteers are intentionally exposed to a pathogen, virus or bacteria, with the primary goal to better understand the human immune response and the effectiveness of potential treatments or vaccines. So that's a challenge study. And interestingly, we did do a challenge study with regards to COVID 19, and this was done in London. And they deliberately exposed a cohort of healthy younger people to the virus just to see what immune responses occurred, who got infected, trying to understand a bit more about the virus. I'd always thought that was a great idea, and we should have done it earlier in the pandemic to try and better understand what was going on. Normally, a challenge study is very strictly adhered to. And in the case of when you're doing it formally, there are a number of things that you have to go through. You have to select your participants very carefully, screen them. You then expose them to a specific dose of the pathogen. And this could be anything, a virus, a bacteria. It's been done on multiple things, including cholera, malaria. And this is something that has been done to try and understand the disease. Then you want to monitor the people very closely to observe and understand the progression of symptoms and infection. Then you would be looking at different treatments to see if they could make a difference. You're looking at your study endpoints, including the onset and severity of symptoms, and then you follow up your participants. So it's quite a thorough mechanism and really, really valuable because oftentimes animal studies can't quite replicate human studies. And then you have people who don't believe we should be studying animals in that way. And so, therefore, human studies are still extremely valuable. Well, the question is, what group are you in? I've broken it down, and this is now me talking about what I was thinking about in relation to the COVID challenge study. Because what we are looking at now is what happens on re exposure to the virus. That's the question now. So it's not about initial exposure. What happens on recurrent or re exposure to the virus based on different cohorts? And the question is, which cohort are you in? You have three groups in my mind: those who are unvaccinated and exposed. And so this group should have natural immunity. I don't think there is anyone left in the world who has not been exposed. So it's only unvaccinated and exposed here. The second group is vaccinated after being exposed. So this would be the cohort who were probably in the front of the pandemic early on. They were highly exposed to virus at multiple times, but subsequently, once the vaccine came out, they were vaccinated to create hybrid immunity. And then you have the third group, those who were sheltering in place, were not exposed to the virus, and then they were vaccinated. So, those are the three groups that I have in my mind at the moment that are relevant in the context of a challenge study. And the question is, what then happens to this group on re exposure as opposed to this group and this group? Is it that this group is the same, meaning that do we find the same responses occurring between those who were exposed and then vaccinated and those who were vaccinated and exposed? What is the difference in the unvaccinated? So these are some really critical scientific questions. And let no one fool you. We don't know the answer to this. We have no idea because we have not actually done it before. Now, there is a little bit of background that can help us to try and understand what could be relevant, but we are now in a phase of the pandemic that is completely unpredictable. And you need to understand that because we have to all try and work out what is going on. So here is my paper today. And as usual, I'll always try and find a paper to show that what we're talking about here is scientific. Oh, this here is a paper. This was from 2020, in December in 2020. And they were looking at coronavirus vaccine development from SARS and MERS to COVID 19. And this was an interesting paper when they were looking at all of this, because one of the questions that I'm surprised people don't ask is why wasn't there a vaccine for SARS CoV? We had almost 17 years before this pandemic. Why wasn't there no vaccine for SARS CoV? It's a really important question. What challenges did they come across? Or was it that it wasn't important enough? Well, when we look carefully at what was happening, we will realize that actually they were looking at different patterns. So here are the clinical trials that were in development for SARS, MERS, and COVID 19. So, just a reminder, SARS CoV is the original infection or epidemic that occurred in Asia in 2003. And at that time, they only had two clinical trials that were ongoing. They had completed phase one, and this was one with a Sinovac inactivated virus, and this one was a DNA vaccine, NIAID. And they had completed these phases up to the point of 2020. They had a number of MERS vaccine clinical trials, and MERS is Middle East respiratory syndrome, and this is the one that occurred in the Middle East in 2012. And they had a number of different vaccine platforms, DNA here, viral vectors, and so on. And so this was a pattern that they were looking at, and there are a number of companies involved in this kind of research. And up to 2020, they then had quite a significant number of these are all the all the vaccine platforms that were then in development at that point in December 2020. Of that, primarily the ones that came out in the forefront was the BioNTech Pfizer, the Moderna, the AstraZeneca, and subsequently J&J, Sinovac, that is the Chinese one, and Novax, the protein based one, as well came through. So these were all of the different vaccines that were being developed in relation to COVID 19. But that question that I asked was a very important question. And this is from my Substack here. I had asked this in October 2022. Simple question. Why was a vaccine not developed against SARS CoV? They had 17 years. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. Let's go back to the original point about that paper that was produced in December 2020. I want to highlight a bit in that paper where they stumbled into a few problems that was a little bit challenging with regards to developing the vaccines. So they were looking here at the MERS, specifically the MERS vaccine here, and essentially, what they were finding is that a number of these specific MERS platform vaccines triggered an immune response. I have to find the right section. They triggered an immune response that was in keeping with an immune pathology, a lung immune pathology. And that was causing some degree of concern as to the development as to what could happen with regards to the vaccine. And it seems as though when we go to my other paper, which is this one here, which is the PloS paper, and this was done in 2012. Immunization with SARS coronavirus vaccines leads to pulmonary immunopathology on challenge. This is the bit that's important. On challenge with the SARS virus. They used about four different types here. They looked at four different vaccines in 2012. Two of them were whole virus vaccines. The other one was a recombinant DNA spike protein vaccine. And the fourth was a virus like particle vaccine that was prepared. So they used four different types of vaccines in this study to try and see if they could find one that worked with regards to SARS CoV. Remember, SARS CoV is very similar to SARS-CoV-2. They're not quite the same. SARS-CoV-2 has a few extra abilities, especially with regards to interferon suppression, but they are very similar in their mechanism of disease presentation and infection, both using ACE2. MERS is slightly different because it uses DPP4. Here was the conclusion of that paper in 2012. And I've highlighted this before, but we need to remember this. So they found that all of the vaccines induced antibody and protection against infection. So that was the first phase. But they then went on to challenge the mice in this case. However, challenge of any of the given vaccines led to occurrence of T helper 2 type immune pathology suggestive of hypersensitivity. This was what led them to conclude caution proceeding to application in humans is indicated. Now, to give credit to our researchers at the time, they probably could not have anticipated where we are today. Because where we are today is that very little testing is going on for the virus, for the new variants. So we don't know who is infected. And we don't know what is happening. We don't even know when they're infected because nobody's checking. And so if you don't know, this is a perfect example of a challenge study. And this is exactly what we're doing. So governments have now tired of the monitoring, and they're no longer monitoring. We're no longer largely testing, And we're now saying that the virus is endemic, let's just live with it. Well, that's fine. But just remember, it's a challenge study. We don't quite know what the outcomes are going to be. If we have immune pathology like what occurred in the previous ones, that's pretty significant. That's something that we should be very, very concerned about. And this is what made them cautious with regards to developing vaccines at that time against SARS CoV. I suspect that one of the reasons why mRNA technology was pushed is because they thought that this kind of response could potentially occur, and maybe by evading the issue with the mRNA technology, they would be in a better position. Because they did find in those studies that when they used nuclear capsids, or nuclear capsids were involved in the whole virus vaccine, it seemed to be a higher risk for that kind of immune pathology. Whatever it is, we are currently at a stage where we don't know what the outcomes are likely to be. Now, here is what we actually need. If we are trying to be scientific, we need autopsies, lots of them, all the time, almost every type that we can have. And I'm going to make a presentation soon about an innovative approach where they do bedside autopsies right after the patient has died. They just do a core biopsy from the lungs, from the liver, from the heart. It's not perfect because you'd want much more detailed histological examination, but believe me, it is a start. Because what we need to know is that when we think about the different cohorts, different groups, the unvaccinated and exposed, in that cohort, you would expect that they have natural immunity. However, let me just make an important point on this, and I'll come back to that group in a second. As I've always said, this is what happens. You have the virus coming in. I'll make this full screen. The virus comes in through the nose, infects the nasal passages, and it then tries to get across the mucosal immune barrier into the systemic circulation. That would be getting to the lymph nodes and then into the bloodstream. But there is a wall of protection here. So the question is, how effective is this wall of protection? If this wall of protection is pretty good with natural immunity, for example, then you don't have to worry too much about the immune pathology because it can't quite get in as efficiently. However, if you continue to have replication, which then spread to the lungs and then crossed into the systemic circulation, then it would still be an issue. And part of my work up as this presentation in the course as well, I was showing what I found was the breakdown in terms of what I think happens. Effective mucosal immunity, yes, largely protected. If you're not quite having effective mucosal immunity, my next question is, do you have interferon autoantibodies? If you don't, you're more protected. But if you do, then I ask about vaccination status. And in effect, what I'm saying here is because of a skewed immune response, primarily towards the spike protein, I think this puts them at a higher risk of recurring infection. And remember that your mucosal immunity fluctuates. This is when it's pretty strong. This is when it's pretty weak. And you can't quite predict when that is. And when it's weak, the virus is more likely to get through. So everything about what is happening is about timing of exposure and your own immune system at that particular time. The point being is this: when we look at the groups, we now need to understand what is happening after infection in all three groups. Is the pathology the same? Is it different? And if it's different, why is it different? How can we mitigate what we would be seeing? So, the fact that we're part of a challenge study, we now need to push our governments and our researchers to do the most important piece of the puzzle, which is autopsies. When patients die, we need to see what's happening in their lungs, in their heart, in their kidneys. These are the main organs that we have to, and the brain. But this is where we are now. Think about where you are, reflect on it, and we now need to try and figure out what that means in the longer term. I hope that that was valuable for you. As usual, remember, if you're interested in the course, click on the link below, and we'll continue to share with you valuable information about COVID-19. Have a great evening.